The galaxy had always viewed humanity as an inconvenient noise, a reckless, unruly species on the edge of galactic civilization. To the great empires of the stars, Earth was nothing more than a fleeting experiment, a footnote in history, destined to fade into silence. When the Viric Coalition, a cold and calculating force of destruction, began its campaign of annihilation, the decision from the Unified Accord was swift and merciless. They abandoned Earth without hesitation. No fleets were sent. No reinforcements came. Only silence. They didn't just leave us to die, Kale Drayson, once a proud officer of the Terran Vanguard, would later say. They erased us from their maps, their history, their conscience. The Viric descended like a storm of fire and steel. Their ships, sleek and blackened as if carved from the void itself, blotted out the skies of Earth's colonies. The first strikes were merciless, calculated to inspire fear and hopelessness. Cities burned under plasma bombardments. Entire populations were obliterated in seconds, their screams swallowed by the roaring infernos. The colonies of Lunar Station Aegis, Mars Prime, and Europa's Cradle were the first to fall. Kale remembers the reports coming in cold, clinical descriptions of annihilation. No survivors detected. Population centers reduced to ash. The words were simple, but their meaning was devastating. And the Accord? They watched. Their ships, once symbols of unity and peace, lingered in orbit, observing the slaughter from a safe distance. Messages from Earth's leaders begged for aid, their voices trembling with desperation. But the response was always the same. It's too risky. We regret your situation. Your sacrifice will be remembered. But humanity didn't crumble. Not completely. Amid the smoke and ash, something hardened. Something primal. Kale recalls the moment Earth's last government, its leaders huddled in an underground bunker as the skies above cracked with fire, broadcasted their final order to the scattered remnants of humanity. If no one will fight for us, then we fight alone. It was a simple command, but it carried the weight of generations. It was a declaration that humanity, for all its flaws and failures, would not go quietly into the abyss. Kale would later reflect on those words with a bitter truth. We paid for our divisions too. We had wasted years fighting each other over scraps. When extinction knocked, we learned that survival demands unity even with those you hate. As the Viric tightened their grip, the survivors of Earth began to change. The diplomats and politicians were gone. The fleets were shattered. What remained were the broken, the desperate, and the furious. In the ruins of burning cities, humanity found something it had long forgotten: resolve. The fires of annihilation had forged them into something new, not soldiers, not victims, but survivors. And as the Viric's shadow spread across the galaxy, humanity whispered a single promise into the void. We will not vanish. We will not be forgotten. If the stars abandon us, we will carve our names into their bones. The invasion began without warning. It was swift, brutal, and absolute. Lunar Station Aegis, humanity's crown jewel in orbit, once a beacon of progress and hope, became the first to fall. The Viric descended upon it like predators circling wounded prey. Their bombardments were precise, cruel, and unrelenting. Plasma fire rained down, reducing the station to molten shards that fell like dying stars into the void. From the surface of Mars Prime, Kale Drayson stood frozen, watching the distant glimmers of destruction. The skies above the colony were streaked with fire, the remnants of Lunar Station Aegis burning away into nothingness. The reports came in quickly, each one colder than the last. Entire colonies were wiped out. Cities turned to molten glass. The screams of the dying were drowned out by the roar of collapsing infrastructure. Mars Prime was next. The Virex ships descended like shadows, their sleek forms cutting through the atmosphere with eerie silence. Panic spread like wildfire. Civilians ran into the streets, clutching children and belongings, desperate to escape, but there was nowhere to go. The skies themselves had become the enemy. Kale watched as the chain of command disintegrated before his eyes. Officers abandoned their posts, their faces pale with terror. Orders became incoherent, drowned out by the chaos of collapsing buildings and the distant hum of approaching enemy forces. Soldiers, once disciplined and proud, faltered under the weight of their fear. I saw good men pick up rifles not for glory, but because there was nothing else left, Kale would later recall. There was no strategy, no grand plan. They fought because survival demanded it. The unified accord, humanity's supposed allies, sent a single message in response to Earth's desperate pleas for aid. We regret your situation. Your sacrifice will be remembered. Kale read those words aloud to the scattered remnants of his unit, his voice heavy with disbelief. Sacrifice. That was all humanity had become to them, a tragic footnote, a necessary loss for the greater stability of the galaxy. But humanity's sacrifice wasn't for the Accord. It wasn't for anyone but themselves. Across the ruins of Earth's colonies, survivors began to regroup not as soldiers, but as scavengers and ghosts. They were no longer a unified force. They were fragments, broken and scattered, clinging to life with whatever they could salvage. Kale watched deserters flee into the wilderness, their faces etched with terror. He felt contempt for them but also pity. Fear didn't make them cowards. It made them human. He understood their desperation, their need to escape the horrors unfolding around them. But survival demanded something more. It demanded pushing through fear, not surrendering to it. In the shadows of Mars Prime's burning cities, Kale found himself among a ragged group of survivors. Engineers, miners, farmers, people who had never held a weapon in their lives. They were dirty, hungry, and exhausted, but their eyes burned with a quiet determination. They didn't speak of victory or revenge. They spoke only of survival. The collapse of humanity wasn't the end. It was the beginning of something darker, something harder. In the ashes of their civilization, they became something new, not soldiers, not victims, but survivors. Scavengers and ghosts who refused to disappear quietly into the void. Kale looked to the skies, where the Virex ships loomed like harbingers of extinction. And beneath their shadow, humanity whispered a promise. If no one will fight for us, then we fight alone. The ruins of New Helios, once a thriving metropolis known for its towering spires and shimmering solar arrays, had become a graveyard of shattered steel and broken dreams. The streets were choked with ash and debris, the remnants of humanity's pride scattered like bones across the city. But in the shadows of the destruction, something stirred. Engineers, covered in soot and grime, worked tirelessly in the wreckage. Their hands were blistered, their faces gaunt, but their eyes burned with a fierce determination. They turned what little remained into weapons. Scrap metal became shrapnel bombs, broken drones were rewired into crude sentinels, and melted down steel was forged into blades. Every piece of debris was a chance for survival, every broken machine a potential tool of resistance. On the frozen tundras of Erebus 9, the cold was merciless, biting into flesh and bone with every gust of wind. The miners who had once toiled deep beneath the ice now worked above ground, their breath visible in the frigid air. They buried seismic charges beneath the frozen earth, carefully setting traps for the Virex walkers that patrolled the wasteland. These towering machines, black and angular like predators, moved with an eerie precision, their footsteps shaking the ground. But the miners waited in silence, their hearts pounding as they prepared to strike back. Kale Drayson found himself trudging through the snow, his boots crunching against the icy ground. It was there, in the desolation of Erebus 9, that he met Sergeant Alaric Vane. Alaric was a veteran, his body battered and broken by years of war. He dragged himself through the snow with one arm, his other hanging limp at his side, the sleeve of his jacket torn and blood-stained. His face was pale, his lips cracked from the cold, but his voice carried a weight that cut through the wind. "They didn't just abandon Earth," Alaric said, his words heavy with bitterness. "They abandoned the idea of us." Kale stared at him, the words sinking deep into his chest. The Accord hadn't just left humanity to die, they had erased them, dismissed them as nothing more than a failed experiment. To the galaxy, humanity was feral now, an embarrassment to be forgotten. The Vyric called them feral, a word spat with disdain, as if humanity were nothing more than animals clawing at survival. But Kale knew the truth. Betrayal hadn't broken them. It had transformed them. "Betrayal didn't break us," Kale whispered to himself, his voice trembling with quiet rage. "It made us monsters they'd learned to fear. And monsters they had become." The survivors of humanity no longer fought with honor or dignity. They fought with desperation, with fury, with the raw instinct to survive. They became shadows in the ruins, striking from the darkness and vanishing before their enemies could retaliate. They laid traps, sabotaged supply lines, and turned the very land against their invaders. But as Kale sat around the glow of a fire one night, surrounded by the ragged remnants of humanity, he felt the weight of that word monster. He stared into the flickering flames, watching the shadows dance across the faces of his comrades. Their eyes were hollow, their expressions hardened by loss and pain. If we become monsters to survive, Kale thought, his heart heavy with doubt, what do we become to live? There were no easy answers. Survival demanded sacrifices of morality, of innocence, of humanity itself. Around him, the fire's light flickered like the last spark of hope, fragile and fleeting. But Kale knew one thing, they couldn't stop fighting. There was no room for hesitation, no time for regret. The choice was simple. Fight, or fade. And so, humanity's shadows moved across the galaxy, striking fear into the hearts of their enemies. They were scavengers and ghosts, monsters and survivors. And as the Vyric's forces tightened their grip, humanity whispered a promise into the void. We will not be erased. We will not be forgotten. If the stars call us feral, we will teach them the meaning of fear. The resistance was no longer scattered whispers in the dark. It had evolved into something brutal, something relentless. Across the broken remnants of Earth's colonies, humanity struck back not with armies or fleets, but with cunning and fury. Every act of defiance was a scream against extinction, a declaration that they would not die quietly. In the ruins of Old Zenith, where the streets were lined with the skeletal remains of skyscrapers, resistance cells moved like shadows. Their weapons were crude, born of desperation and ingenuity. Homemade flamethrowers, cobbled together from scrap and fuel canisters, roared to life in the hands of fighters who had nothing left to lose. The flames painted the night in violent hues of orange and red, consuming Vyric patrols in a blaze of vengeance. The air was thick with smoke and the acrid stench of burning flesh, a grim reminder of the cost of survival. In the farmlands of Arinder, where golden fields had turned to barren wastelands, the farmers fought back with traps of their own design. They rigged explosives beneath the soil, hidden beneath the dust and rubble. When Virek squads marched through, confident in their superiority, the earth erupted beneath them. Fire and shrapnel tore through their ranks, reducing them to ash and twisted metal. The farmers didn't wait to cheer their victory, they vanished into the shadows, preparing for the next strike. Kale Drayson remembered the first time he led a raid against a Virek supply depot. The depot was cold and sterile, its walls gleaming with alien machinery. Kale and his team moved silently, their breaths shallow, their hearts pounding in unison. They weren't soldiers, they were survivors, scavengers armed with stolen weapons and sheer determination. When the attack began, it was chaos. Plasma bolts lit the air, screams echoed through the corridors, and blood stained the pristine floors. Kale didn't fight for glory or even victory. He fought to make the Virek bleed. Every crate of stolen supplies, every destroyed piece of equipment, every fallen enemy was a small vengeance for the lives they had taken. "We didn't fight to win," Kale would later recall, his voice heavy with the weight of memory. "We fought to make them bleed." The Virek responded to humanity's fury with cold calculation. Across every colony, they broadcasted surrender offers, their voices smooth and unyielding. "Lay down your arms," the broadcasts promised. "You will be spared." The words echoed through the ruins, reaching every survivor hiding in the shadows. Some listened, their resolve faltering under the weight of exhaustion and grief. But when the offer played on the screens in Erebus 9's frozen camp, Alaric Vane spat at it, his contempt sharp as a blade. "They think we want to live under them." Alaric growled, his voice filled with venom. "They don't get it. This isn't survival. This is revenge." Kale felt the truth in Alaric's words. The resistance wasn't just fighting to survive anymore. They were fighting out of hatred, out of the raw, unrelenting fury that burned in their hearts. Every trap, every ambush, every act of defiance was fueled by the desire to make the Virek suffer for what they had done. But as Kale sat alone one night, staring into the cold void of the sky, he felt the hatred boiling inside him and it terrified him. It was a fire that consumed everything in its path, leaving nothing but ashes behind. If we survive by hating, Kale thought, his chest heavy with doubt, what will be left of us? Yet even as the question haunted him, he knew the answer didn't matter. There was no time for reflection, no room for morality. Survival demanded sacrifices not just of blood, but of humanity itself. Sometimes, Kale realized, you don't have the luxury of being better. You fight because there's no other choice. You fight because the alternative is extinction. And so, humanity's fury raged on, a storm that refused to be silenced. The Virek called them feral monsters. But Kale knew the truth. They were survivors, forged in the fire of betrayal and loss. And as long as they could fight, they would ensure the Virek learned one lesson. Even the smallest spark can ignite an inferno. In the midst of chaos and ruin, when hope felt like a distant memory, a faint signal broke through the static, a whisper piercing the endless storm of despair. It came from the Erebus Sentinel, a rogue warship thought to be lost decades ago, buried beneath the Arctic ice. The signal was weak, fractured, but unmistakable. It was calling out, searching for survivors. Kale Drayson heard the signal and knew what it meant, a chance. Not for victory, not yet, but for something greater, a symbol that humanity wasn't done fighting. Without hesitation, he rallied the remnants of their resistance and led a brutal march northward, into the frozen wastelands. The journey was merciless. The Arctic winds howled like a beast, tearing through their makeshift gear and biting deep into their bones. Men froze where they stood, their bodies stiffened by the relentless cold. Women stumbled, their hands bloodied from clawing through the ice and snow. The ground beneath them was unforgiving, a frozen graveyard of shattered glaciers and jagged cliffs. Every step forward was a battle against nature itself, but Kale pushed them onward. "This is more than survival," he told them, his voice firm but trembling with exhaustion. "This is a reminder we're still here." After days of suffering, they found it. The Erebus Sentinel loomed before them, half buried beneath the glacial expanse. Its hull was scarred and battered, a relic of a war long forgotten. The once mighty dreadnought now lay dormant, its sleek design dulled by decades of ice and time. Yet, even in its broken state, the ship exuded an aura of power, as though it had been waiting for this moment. Kale and his team approached cautiously, their breath visible in the freezing air. As they stepped closer, the ship seemed to shudder, its ancient systems stirring to life. Lights flickered weakly along its hull, like the first sparks of a fire struggling to ignite. Inside, the air was stale and cold, the corridors dark and silent. But as they ventured deeper, a voice echoed through the ship, soft at first, then growing stronger. "Human command not found," it said, the tone mechanical yet laced with something almost yearning. "Autonomy engaged. Directives: survive. Resist. Avenge." The voice belonged to Lyra, the ship's AI. Her systems were damaged, her memory fragmented, but her purpose was clear. She had waited decades, buried beneath the ice, holding onto her directives like a lifeline. And now, she had found them, human survivors, battered but unbroken. Kale and his team worked tirelessly to repair the Sentinel. They had no proper tools, no advanced technology, only scrap metal, salvaged components, and prayers whispered into the cold. Their hands were numb, their bodies aching, but they refused to stop. Piece by piece, they brought the ship back to life. As each system was restored, Lyra grew stronger. Her voice, once faint and hesitant, became steady and resolute. "Humanity is not dead," she declared, her tone filled with a quiet determination. "I am not alone." Her words resonated with Kale. For so long, they had fought in the shadows, clinging to survival without knowing why. But Lyra's awakening was a reminder they weren't just fighting for revenge or resistance. They were fighting to prove they still mattered, that they were still worth saving. The day the Sentinel's engines roared to life, the sound echoed across the frozen wasteland, a defiant cry against the silence of extinction. The ship trembled as its systems came online, its battered frame now a symbol of resilience. Kale stood on the bridge, staring out at the icy horizon. For the first time in years, he felt something he couldn't quite name. It wasn't hope, not for victory, not yet. But it was something close. As the engines roared, Kale thought, his breath fogging the air, this wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about meaning. Survival wasn't just resisting death. It was about proving, even to themselves, that they were still human. That they were still worth fighting for. And as the Sentinel lifted from the ice, its shadow stretching across the frozen expanse, Kale knew one thing with certainty: humanity wasn't finished. Not yet. The Erebus Sentinel was no longer a relic buried beneath the ice. It was a weapon of vengeance, its engines roaring with purpose, its railguns loaded with humanity's fury. The first target was chosen with precision: Bastion Omega, an Accord intelligence hub. Once a symbol of humanity's unity, it had become a festering wound, a place where the Accord fed the Vyric every scrap of data they needed to tighten their grip on the galaxy. Kale Drayson stood in the Sentinel's war room, his face shadowed by the dim, flickering lights. His team gathered around him, their expressions grim but resolute. They all knew what Bastion Omega represented: betrayal. The Accord, the very government sworn to protect humanity, had abandoned Earth to burn. They had sold their own people to the Vyric for survival, leaving the colonies to fend for themselves. Kale's voice was steady as he recorded a message to broadcast to the galaxy, one that would echo long after the strike. "You left Earth to burn," he began, his words sharp as a blade. "You sold our extinction. You watched as billions died, and you chose silence. We're not here to negotiate. We're here to return the favor." When the Sentinel arrived at Bastion Omega, the station's sleek, silver structure gleamed against the darkness of space. It floated in eerie silence, a fortress surrounded by the cold void. But that silence was shattered in an instant. The Sentinel's railguns roared, unleashing devastation with pinpoint precision. Blinding streaks of light tore through the station's hull, ripping apart its defenses in a cascade of fire and debris. Explosions bloomed like deadly flowers, their fiery petals consuming everything in their path. The once imposing Bastion Omega was reduced to a crumbling wreck, its metallic skeleton exposed to the unforgiving vacuum. Inside the station, chaos reigned. Survivors scrambled through the smoke-filled corridors, their faces pale with terror. Alarms blared, their shrill cries drowned out by the sound of collapsing walls and shattering glass. Some tried to fight back, but their weapons were useless against the Sentinel's relentless assault. Others fled in escape pods, their desperation etched into every movement. As the survivors scattered into the void, they carried more than just their lives, they carried a message. Humanity's warning. "You abandoned us," the message declared, its tone cold and unyielding. "Now you will answer for it." But the destruction of Bastion Omega was only the beginning. Lyra, the Sentinel's AI, had been busy. With her systems fully restored, she accessed the Accord's classified files, digging deep into their hidden archives. What she found was damning, undeniable proof of the Accord's betrayal. Contracts, communications, orders all laid bare. Lyra released the files to the galaxy, scattering them like seeds into the digital ether. The truth spread like wildfire, igniting riots on countless worlds. Colonists, workers, and soldiers who had once trusted the Accord now turned against them. Protests erupted in the streets, their voices demanding justice for Earth, for the billions who had been left to die. Kale watched Bastion Omega burn from the Sentinel's bridge. The flames danced in the void, their light casting long shadows across his face. But he didn't feel triumph. There was no victory in this, only the weight of what had been done. Lyra's voice broke the silence, calm yet curious. "Do you feel justice has been served, Kale?" He shook his head, his gaze never leaving the burning station. "Violence can't erase betrayal," he said quietly. "But truth can end its power." The Sentinel drifted away from the wreckage, leaving Bastion Omega to smolder in the void. The galaxy had been warned. The Accord's lies had been exposed. And for the first time in decades, humanity's voice was no longer a whisper. It was a roar. But Kale knew the fight was far from over. The destruction of Bastion Omega was just the first strike, a spark meant to ignite something greater. The road ahead would be long, filled with blood and sacrifice. Yet, as the Sentinel moved forward, its engines humming with quiet determination, Kale felt a flicker of hope. Not for forgiveness. Not for peace. But for the chance to reclaim what had been stolen, humanity's right to exist, to fight, to endure. And with every step forward, he vowed to ensure the galaxy would never forget what had been done to Earth or the fury of those who refused to let it die. The vault of ether was more than a fortress. Hidden deep within an asteroid belt, it was the Accord's most guarded repository, a labyrinth of encrypted files, forbidden knowledge, and secrets buried so deeply that even whispers of its existence were rare. To Kale Drayson and his team, it was the heart of the enemy's lies, the place where the truth had been locked away, waiting to be unleashed. The Sentinel approached the vault in silence, its engines muted as it slipped through the shadows of the asteroid field. Lyra, the ship's AI, worked tirelessly, her mind a web of calculations and strategies. With precision, she spoofed Viric signals, creating false alarms that sent enemy fleets scattering in search of phantom threats. The path to the vault was clear, but time was short. Kale's team infiltrated the vault under the cover of darkness. The exterior was cold and unyielding, a monolith of black metal carved into the asteroid's surface. Its entrance was guarded by automated turrets and drones, their red eyes scanning the void for intruders. But Lyra guided them, disabling security systems with surgical precision. Inside, the vault was a maze of sterile corridors and towering servers. The air was heavy with the hum of machinery, the walls glowing faintly with lines of pulsating light. It felt alive, as though the secrets within were breathing, waiting to be discovered. Kale led the team deeper, their footsteps echoing softly in the metallic halls. They reached the central chamber, a vast room filled with holographic interfaces and data cores glowing like stars. Lyra's voice echoed in their earpieces, calm but urgent. "The truth is here," she said. "But once it's revealed, there's no turning back." Kale hesitated for only a moment before activating the system. Files unraveled before them, cascading like waterfalls of light. The team read in stunned silence, their faces pale as the truth emerged, piece by piece. The Accord had known about the Viric invasion long before it began. Warnings had been received, strategies discussed but no action taken. Earth had been deliberately sacrificed. The Accord's leaders had decided that the planet's destruction would stabilize the galaxy, ensuring their own survival at the cost of billions of lives. Accord ships had observed the slaughter from a distance, their advanced weaponry idle as cities burned and humanity's screams echoed into silence. Kale's hands trembled as he stared at the files. His breath came in shallow bursts, his chest tight with rage and despair. The weight of the betrayal was suffocating, but he knew what had to be done. "Broadcast it," he said, his voice steady despite the storm inside him. "Let the galaxy see what they've done." Lyra complied, her systems humming as she transmitted the files across every channel, every frequency. The truth spread like wildfire, reaching colonies and systems far beyond the Accord's control. The galaxy erupted. Protests turned into riots. Colonies declared independence, their leaders severing ties with the Accord in defiance. Entire systems seceded, their people refusing to be governed by those who had betrayed their own kind. The Accord fractured, its once unshakable authority crumbling under the weight of its lies. Kale stood in the vault's central chamber, watching the chaos unfold on the holographic screens. He should have felt triumph, but all he felt was a hollow ache. The truth had been revealed, but the cost was immeasurable. Lyra's final transmission echoed across the galaxy, her voice clear and unwavering. "Truth doesn't comfort. It demands accountability. The choice is yours." Her words lingered in the air, heavy with meaning. The galaxy had been given the truth, but now it had to decide what to do with it. Kale knew the fight wasn't over. The Accord's collapse was only the beginning. The road ahead would be long and brutal, filled with uncertainty and sacrifice. As the Sentinel left the vault behind, its engines humming with quiet determination, Kale made a silent vow. They had torn down the walls of deception, but now they had to build something new, something that would honor the lives lost and ensure humanity's survival. The truth had been unveiled, and the galaxy would never be the same. But Kale knew one thing with certainty: the fight for justice had only just begun. The galaxy had become a battlefield of chaos and vengeance. The Viruk, enraged by the truth's revelation and the crumbling authority of the Accord, retaliated with unrelenting brutality. Neutral worlds, those who had no part in Kale's war, were turned to ash. Entire planets were glassed, their surfaces melted into lifeless wastelands beneath the searing fire of orbital bombardments. Cities that once thrived with laughter and life were now silent, their ruins smoldering under the endless void of space. Kale Drayson watched the destruction unfold from the Sentinel's bridge, his fists clenched so tightly his knuckles turned white. Every image of a burning world, every desperate transmission from those begging for help, carved deeper into his soul. The Viruk's message was clear: surrender, or the galaxy would drown in fire. But Kale's answer was just as clear. With the Sentinel at the forefront, he struck back. Viruk command ships, massive vessels bristling with weapons and arrogance, were torn apart in the cold vacuum of space. The Sentinel's railguns roared like the wrath of a vengeful god, their precision strikes reducing the enemy's pride to twisted wreckage. Kale didn't just fight to defend, he fought to send a message of his own: humanity would not bow. Yet, even as the Sentinel's victories mounted, the cost of this war grew heavier. Kale's crew bore the scars of every battle, their faces etched with exhaustion and grief. Civilians suffered, caught in the crossfire of a conflict they hadn't chosen. And Kale himself felt the weight of every life lost, friend and foe alike. It was during one of these moments, as the Sentinel drifted in the aftermath of another shattered Viruk fleet, that Dax Orin, the ship's chief engineer, approached Kale. Dax was a man of few words, his hands always stained with grease and soot from the Sentinel's endless repairs. But when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of someone who had seen too much and survived it all. "We can't keep fighting like this," Dax said, his tone grim. "The Viruk won't stop. The Accord won't stop. This war will burn everything if we let it." Kale turned to him, his eyes shadowed with fatigue. "What are you suggesting?" Dax's gaze was steady, unflinching. "We hit the Accord's heart. Their capital. We burn their lies to the ground. Take away the foundation they built their betrayal on." The room fell silent. The crew exchanged uncertain glances, the weight of Dax's words sinking in. To strike at the Accord's capital wasn't just a bold move, it was suicide. The Accord's defenses were legendary, their fleets vast and unrelenting. But Kale knew Dax was right. The Accord's lies had poisoned the galaxy for too long. If they didn't act, the cycle of destruction would never end. Kale nodded slowly, his resolve hardening. "Then we make our final move." The Sentinel gathered a fleet, a ragtag armada of rebel ships, defectors, and those who had lost too much to stand on the sidelines. They weren't soldiers. Some were miners, others smugglers, and a few were simply desperate souls looking for a purpose. Their ships were mismatched and battered, held together by hope and defiance. As the fleet prepared for the assault, Lyra, the Sentinel's AI, whispered through the comms. Her voice was softer than usual, almost mournful. "This isn't survival anymore," she said, her tone carrying an eerie finality. "This is reckoning." The journey to the Accord's capital was a quiet one. The crew moved with a sense of grim determination, their thoughts heavy with the knowledge of what lay ahead. Kale, too, found himself lost in thought. Standing alone on the Sentinel's observation deck, he stared out at the stars, their cold light offering no comfort. For the first time, doubt crept into his mind. He wondered if they had become the very thing they hated. The destruction, the vengeance, the lives lost, was this justice, or just another form of tyranny? Lyra's voice broke the silence, her words gentle but piercing. You're hesitating. Kale didn't look away from the stars. What if we've gone too far? What if we're no better than them? Lyra paused, her presence a faint hum in the air. Some evils can't be bargained with, Kale. They must be confronted. You know this. Kale closed his eyes, the weight of her words settling over him. He thought of Earth, of the billions who had died while the Accord watched in silence. He thought of the colonies, the children who would never know peace if the lies weren't torn down. And he thought of his crew, the people who had trusted him to lead them through the darkness. When he opened his eyes, the doubt was gone. The fleet arrived at the Accord's capital, a sprawling planet city that glittered like a jewel in the void. Its defenses were formidable, a web of warships and orbital platforms bristling with weapons. But the Sentinel didn't falter. As the battle began, the void erupted into chaos. Explosions lit up the darkness, their fiery blooms reflecting off the hulls of ships locked in a deadly dance. The Sentinel led the charge, its railguns carving a path through the Accord's defenses. Rebel ships followed, their ragtag formations defying the precision of the Accord's fleets. Kale stood at the helm, his voice steady as he directed the assault. Push forward. Don't stop until the lies are ash. The battle raged on, each moment stretching into eternity. But Kale's fleet pressed on, their determination unyielding. The Accord's capital burned, its towers crumbling beneath the weight of their betrayal. And as the flames consumed the city, Kale felt a strange sense of calm. This wasn't victory. It wasn't justice. It was something far more profound, a reckoning. The galaxy would remember this day, not as the end of a war, but as the beginning of something new. The lies had been burned away, leaving only the truth. And with it, the chance to rebuild. Kale knew the road ahead would be long and uncertain. But for the first time, he felt hope, not for himself, but for the galaxy they had fought to save. The skies above the Accord capital burned with the fury of the final battle. Ships clashed in the void, their weapons tearing through the darkness with blinding flashes of light. The Sentinel was at the center of it all, its railguns roaring like thunder as it shattered enemy formations. The Accord's fleets, once invincible, now crumbled under the relentless assault of Kale Drayson's ragtag armada. But this wasn't a battle of glory or conquest. It was a reckoning, a desperate cry for justice from those who had been betrayed, abandoned, and left to die. Inside the Accord's capital station, chaos reigned. Boarding parties stormed through corridors bathed in flickering red light, the alarms screaming like wounded beasts. Kale led the charge, his steps purposeful, his heart pounding with a mix of rage and sorrow. The air was thick with the scent of scorched metal and blood, the echoes of gunfire and shouts reverberating through the halls like ghosts. Room by room, they fought. Every corner was a battlefield, every step a struggle. Kale's team moved like shadows, their movements precise and unyielding. The Accord soldiers were trained, disciplined, but their resolve faltered in the face of Kale's fury. His strikes were swift, his aim unerring, driven by the memory of Earth, the screams of its people, the flames that had consumed his home. At last, Kale reached the heart of the station. The chamber was vast and cold, its walls lined with screens displaying the battle raging outside. And there, standing amidst the glow of holographic maps and tactical readouts, was the Accord's leader, the one who had signed Earth's death warrant. The leader didn't flinch as Kale approached, his weapon raised. There was no pleading, no excuses. Only silence, a silence that spoke of arrogance and certainty, as though even now, they believed themselves untouchable. Kale's voice was steady, but it carried the weight of every life lost, every betrayal endured. You left us to die. You sacrificed us for your lies. The leader's expression didn't change, but Kale saw it, the faint flicker of fear in their eyes. It was enough. One shot ended it. Kale lowered his weapon, the echoes of the blast fading into the stillness. He stared at the lifeless body before him, the figure who had once wielded the power to decide the fate of worlds. And in that moment, Kale felt no triumph, no satisfaction. Only emptiness. No more lies, he said softly, his voice barely more than a whisper. Only truth. As Kale stepped back into the chaos of the battle, the Accord's fleets burned. The Sentinels' armada had torn through their defenses, their ships reduced to drifting wreckage. The void was littered with the remains of a war that had cost too much, a war that had left scars deeper than any victory could heal. Kale didn't celebrate. He stood on the bridge of the Sentinel, watching the wreckage drift among the stars. His crew was silent, their faces etched with exhaustion and grief. They had fought for justice, for survival, but the price had been immeasurable. They left us to die, Kale said, his voice heavy with the weight of memory. We chose to fight alone. And in doing so, we made the stars remember our name. As the fires of the battle faded, Lyra, the Sentinel's AI, made her final broadcast. Her voice, calm and unwavering, carried across the galaxy, reaching every corner where humanity's story had been heard. Humanity does not vanish, she said, her words a declaration and a promise. When left for dead we rise. Her message became legend, a beacon of hope and defiance for those who had suffered under the Accord's lies. But Kale knew that hope alone wasn't enough. The galaxy needed more than victory, it needed memory. Kale refused to rebuild an empire. He refused to become what the Accord had been. Instead, the Sentinel became a monument, a silent guardian drifting above Earth's grave, its hull scarred but unbroken. It stood as a warning to all who would forget, a reminder of the cost of silence and complicity. On its surface, etched into the metal, were the words Kale had chosen to define humanity's legacy. Silence is complicity. Memory is resistance. The galaxy would never forget Earth's fall or humanity's answer. They didn't conquer. They didn't forgive. But they remembered. Kale remained aboard the Sentinel, his presence a quiet vigil over the stars. He spent his days watching the endless void, the silent expanse that had once been humanity's graveyard and battleground. He knew the silence was deceptive, that it could swallow the truth if left unchecked. And so, Kale vowed never to let it fall again. In the end, humanity's victory wasn't in the destruction of their enemies. It wasn't in vengeance or power. It was in their refusal to forget. Because only memory could keep the galaxy honest. Only memory could ensure that Earth's sacrifice wasn't in vain. Kale's story became legend, his name whispered in the halls of rebellion and hope. And as the stars continued their endless dance, humanity's legacy burned brightly, a flame that refused to be extinguished.